Friends, brothers and sisters, seekers of truth wherever you have come from tonight, I want to begin not with a date or a fact, but with a question, because that is how this whole story begins. The question is simple, and yet it has unsettled empires of thought for 800 years. What does it actually mean to know God? Not to know about God, not to memorize the arguments for God's existence, not to master the grammar of Scripture, not to be able to recite the sayings of the prophets and the rulings of the jurists with flawless precision. But to know God the way you know the warmth of a fire when your hand is near it, the way you know the presence of someone you love when they walk into a room before you have even turned to look. That kind of knowing has a name in the Islamic mystical tradition. It is called Marifat. And tonight, we are going to walk through one of the most extraordinary human stories ever recorded, the story of how a brilliant, respected, celebrated religious scholar named Jalal al-Din Muhammad, whom the world would come to call Rumi, was pulled out of the safety of what he knew and thrown into the fire of what he could only feel, by a wandering, unwashed, fierce old man named Shams-e-Din of Tabriz. Before we speak of Shams, we must first understand who Rumi was before Shams arrived, because the size of the transformation only makes sense once we understand the size of the man who was transformed. Rumi was born around the year 1207 in the city of Balkh, in a region that today sits at the crossroads of Afghanistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, a part of the world then pulsing with scholarship, trade and Persian literary culture. His father Bahal-Din Walad was himself a respected theologian and mystic, a preacher whose sermons carried the fire of a man who had tasted something beyond the dry theology of his peers. When Rumi was still a child, his family fled westward, likely driven by the growing threat of the Mongol invasions that would soon flatten the cities of Central Asia. This was not a small relocation. This was a caravan carrying a family across the breadth of the Islamic world, through Baghdad, through Mecca on pilgrimage, through Damascus, before finally settling in the city of Konya, in the heart of Anatolia, what is now central Turkey, under the patronage of the Seljuk Sultanate. Konya in the 13th century was not a backwater. It was a genuine crossroads of civilizations, a city where Persian poets, Greek Christian communities, Armenian merchants, and Turkish rulers all lived within the same walls, where Sufi lodges sat near churches, where the intellectual air was thick with philosophy, theology and poetry arriving from every direction the trade routes could reach. It was into this rich and cosmopolitan setting that young Rumi grew, was educated, and eventually inherited his father's position as a teacher and preacher after his father's death. Rumi did not simply inherit a job, he inherited an entire world of scholarly obligation. He traveled to Aleppo and Damascus for further study in Islamic law and theology, sitting under some of the great teachers of his age, absorbing jurisprudence, Quranic exegesis, hadith scholarship, and the intricate architecture of Islamic law. By the time he returned to Konya in his mid-20s, he was already a formidable scholar in his own right, and upon his father's death he stepped into the role of a respected jurist and professor, teaching in the madrasas, delivering sermons, surrounded by hundreds of students and disciples who hung on every word of his legal rulings. Picture this man for a moment. Rumi at this stage of his life was, by every external measure, a success. He wore the robes of religious authority. He had a substantial following. He was consulted on questions of law. He preached with eloquence that already hinted at the poetic gift that would later shake the world, though it was channeled at this point into sober religious instruction, rather than ecstatic verse. He had a family, a household, a position of civic respect. If you had met Rumi in the year 1244, before the encounter we are about to describe, you would have met an impressive man, but you would not have met a man whose name would still be spoken with reverence and love 8 centuries later on every continent of the earth. Something was missing, though Rumi himself may not have known exactly what. He had Marifat's cousin, which is ilm, structured knowledge, but he did not yet have the burning, unmediated knowing that would soon consume him. Now let us turn to the other figure in our story, the wandering dervish, who would walk into Rumi's ordered world and set it ablaze. Shams-e-Din of Tabriz remains, even after 8 centuries of scholarship, a figure wrapped in mystery. We know he was born in Tabriz, in the northwest of Persia, likely sometime in the middle of the 12th century, which would have made him considerably older than Rumi by the time they finally met. Accounts describe his father as a merchant, and describe Shams himself, from a young age, as someone unusually intense in his spiritual hunger, restless, unable to settle under any single teacher for long because he felt each one fell short of the completeness he was searching for. He earned, according to tradition, the nickname Parinda, the flying one, or the bird, because of his habit of never staying anywhere for long, of appearing suddenly in a city, staying briefly, and then vanishing again, often under cover of night, without explanation, driven by some inner compass that others could not read. Shams was not a conventional Sufi master in the sense of running a lodge with formal disciples, wearing the robes of an established order, and building an institutional legacy. He seems to have been something rarer and more dangerous, a solitary realized soul, uninterested in fame, uninterested in comfort, uninterested in being anyone's polished spiritual celebrity. Later collections of his sayings, known as the Makalat, or the Discourses, reveal a man of blistering honesty, impatient with hypocrisy, unimpressed by titles, and utterly uninterested in flattering the egos of the religious establishment, even the parts of that establishment that considered themselves spiritually advanced. He is recorded as having little patience for scholars who could quote endless texts about love, but had never once let their hearts be broken open by it. He wandered for decades, we are told, searching for one thing, a companion capable of bearing the full weight of what he had come to know, someone whose vessel was strong enough not to shatter under the pressure of direct, unfiltered spiritual truth. He is said to have prayed for years asking to be led to such a person. And then, in the autumn of the year 1244, in the city of Konya, that search reportedly ended. There are several versions of how Shams and Rumi actually met, passed down through different biographical traditions, and it is worth pausing on this, because the multiplicity of the story tells us something important. The most beloved version, though probably more legend than strict historical record, describes Shams stopping Rumi in the street, or in a marketplace near an inn, as Rumi rode past surrounded by his students. Shams is said to have grabbed the reins of Rumi's mount, or approached him directly, and posed a piercing question, something along the lines of asking who was greater, the Prophet Muhammad or the 9th century mystic Bayazid Bastami. Given that Bayazid had once declared in ecstatic utterance that his own glory was greater than anything, while the Prophet had prayed humbly to God acknowledging his own human limitation. It is a question designed not to be answered with a textbook definition, but to expose whether the person being asked has ever actually touched the difference between spiritual intoxication and prophetic completeness, between a man overwhelmed by a taste of the divine and a man who carries the entire weight of revelation with sober responsibility. Rumi, according to this account, gave an answer of such depth and precision that Shams recognized instantly that he had finally found the one he had been searching for his entire life, and Rumi simultaneously felt something crack open inside himself that no amount of formal study had ever touched. Another version places their meeting near a fountain or pool, where Shams is said to have thrown Rumi's precious books into the water, and when Rumi cried out in anguish at the loss of his hard-won library, Shams calmly reached in and retrieved them completely dry, telling Rumi that this was knowledge that came from a different source, one Rumi did not yet possess. Whether these specific episodes happened exactly as later hagiography records them, historians debate. What is not debated is the outcome. From the moment Rumi and Shams encountered each other, Rumi's entire life was rerouted. What happened next stunned everyone who knew Rumi. The respected professor, the dignified jurist, the man whose sermons had drawn crowds, simply withdrew from public teaching. He began spending nearly all of his time in seclusion with this strange uncredentialed wanderer, someone with no official scholarly rank, no institutional pedigree, no title that Rumi's students or the Konya religious establishment could recognize or respect. For weeks, and by many accounts for months, Rumi and Shams remained closeted together, sometimes for days at a stretch without eating, absorbed in a companionship, in Sufi terms called suhabat, that the outside world simply could not categorize. This was not master instructing student in the ordinary sense, and it was not two equals debating philosophy. It was something closer to two mirrors placed opposite one another, in which whatever was true in one was reflected instantly and undeniably in the other. Rumi later described what he experienced with Shams as no longer feeling the two of them to be separate people at all, but a single reality wearing two forms, a union so complete that ordinary language of teacher and disciple became almost meaningless to describe it. This is the heart of the transformation we are here tonight to understand, and it is worth slowing down to really absorb what Marifat means in this context, because it is easy to use the word gnosis, or mystical knowledge, and let it float past as an abstraction. Marifat in the Sufi tradition is distinguished from ilm precisely because ilm can be transmitted through books, through lectures, through the careful transmission of texts from teacher to student across generations, while Marifat cannot be transmitted that way at all. Marifat has to be lived. It arrives, the Sufis say, only through experience, only through the direct unveiling of the heart, often only after the heart has been broken, humbled, or emptied of its previous certainties. Rumi had spent his entire life climbing the mountain of ilm, and he had climbed it about as high as any human being of his era could climb it. But Marifat required him to do something ilm never asks of a person. It required him to admit that he did not know, to let go of the authority his robes and his title had given him, and to sit, empty-handed, in the presence of someone who had already walked that road. Shams did not teach Rumi new facts. Shams removed the veils that Rumi's own erudition, ironically, had built up around his heart. This is a paradox at the very center of the Sufi path, that sometimes the greatest obstacle to knowing God directly is not ignorance but overconfident knowledge, the comfortable feeling that because you can discuss a subject fluently, you have therefore experienced it. Under Shams's influence, and really under the sheer force of this relationship, Rumi began to change outwardly as well as inwardly. The formal jurist who had once delivered careful legal opinions from a raised pulpit began, according to the traditional accounts, to enter states of spiritual ecstasy, to turn in circles as a form of prayer and remembrance, moved by an inner rhythm that would, generations later, crystallize into the formal practice of the whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, the Sama ceremony that remains one of the most recognizable spiritual images to come out of the Islamic mystical tradition. Music, which conservative jurists of the time often regarded with suspicion as a distraction from proper worship, became for Rumi a doorway into remembrance of the divine, the reed flute's mournful cry becoming, in his later poetry, the great central image of a soul separated from its source, and longing to return to it. Above all, poetry itself began to pour out of him, not composed carefully at a writing desk in the way a scholar drafts a legal treatise, but bursting out of him, in states of spiritual absorption, sometimes dictated on the spot, to scribes who struggled to keep pace with the flow of verses. This was not a minor personality shift. This was, in every meaningful sense, the birth of the Rumi that the entire world would eventually come to know, and none of it would have happened without Shams. We should also be honest about what this transformation cost Rumi, and what it cost the people around him, because a story this beautiful can be told in a way that flattens the very real human turbulence involved. Rumi's students, who had once had daily access to their beloved teacher's lectures on law and theology, now found themselves largely shut out. The relationship between Rumi and Shams consumed so much of Rumi's attention that his household, including his family and his circle of disciples, grew increasingly resentful of this stranger who had, in their eyes, stolen their master away from them. Jealousy is a very human thing, and it does not disappear simply because the subject under discussion is spiritual love rather than any other kind of attachment. Rumi's students began to murmur, then to openly complain, then, according to several accounts, to threaten Shams. The tension in Rumi's household and among his followers grew so severe that Shams, sensing the danger and perhaps also sensing that his continued presence was doing as much harm as good to the community around Rumi, disappeared from Konya without warning. Likely sometime in the year 1246, less than 2 years after their fateful meeting. The effect on Rumi was devastating. The man who had begun to compose ecstatic poetry in the fullness of companionship, now poured out verses of raw grief and desperate longing, searching everywhere for signs of where Shams had gone. Word eventually reached Rumi that Shams had been seen in Damascus, and Rumi, still the respected head of a religious community, still a father, still a public figure, nonetheless sent his own son Sultan Walad to travel to Damascus to find Shams and beg him to return. Remarkably, Shams agreed and returned to Konya, and for a time the companionship resumed, seemingly with even greater intensity than before, an intensity that, if anything, inflamed the jealousy of Rumi's circle even further. This time, Rumi tried to protect the relationship by arranging for Shams to marry a young woman who had been raised in Rumi's own household, hoping perhaps that formalizing Shams's place within the family structure would settle the unrest around him. It did not. Sometime around the end of the year 1247, Shams disappeared again, and this time he did not return. What exactly happened has never been definitively established, and this uncertainty is itself part of what has made the story so hauntingly powerful across the centuries. The most persistent tradition, supported by some later historical investigation, suggests that Shams was murdered, possibly with the involvement of some of Rumi's own disciples, or even in some versions of the story, with the tragic involvement of Rumi's own son Ala al-Din, who is said to have harbored deep resentment toward Shams. Other accounts are more ambiguous, suggesting simply that Shams vanished, perhaps choosing once again the solitary wandering life he had always lived, this time permanently, understanding that his role in Rumi's transformation was complete, and that his continued physical presence had become too costly for the community around his beloved friend to bear. Whatever the precise truth, and we may never know it with certainty, Shams ad-Din of Tabriz was gone from Rumi's life forever. after a relationship that had lasted, all told, only a matter of a few short years. What Rumi did with that loss is, in many ways, the second half of this story, and arguably the part that changed world literature and world spirituality permanently. Rumi searched for Shams obsessively at first, traveling again to Damascus in the hope of finding him, walking the streets of that city calling his name. And then, according to the traditional accounts, something shifted inside him. Rumi came to a realization that would become one of the central teachings not just of his own life, but of the entire body of poetry he would leave behind. That Shams had never truly been separate from him in the first place. That the union they had experienced together was not something located in a physical body that could be lost, but a reality of the heart that death or distance or disappearance could not actually destroy. Rumi is recorded as having said, in essence, why should I search for him outside myself, when he and I are one, when his light shines through my own being? This realization did not end Rumi's grief, but it transformed the container that grief was poured into. Instead of collapsing entirely, Rumi began to write. What emerged over the following years was an outpouring of poetry, unlike almost anything the Persian language, or arguably any language, had produced before. Rumi composed thousands of ghazals and lyric poems, an enormous body of work that he gathered under the title Diwan-e Shams-e Tabrizi, the collected poems of Shams of Tabriz, deliberately signing this vast collection, not with his own name, as would have been customary, but with the name of his beloved lost friend, as though the poetry itself belonged to Shams, as though Rumi had become simply the reed through which Shams's breath now passed into the world. This is an extraordinary literary and spiritual gesture. Rumi, a man who had once been addressed with honorific titles as a master jurist, effectively erased his own authorial identity from his greatest early body of poetic work and replaced it with the name of the man who had broken him open. It tells us that for Rumi, the boundary between self and beloved, between lover and the object of love, had genuinely dissolved, at least in the poetic and spiritual sense, and that this dissolution, this fana, this annihilation of the separate ego self into the reality of love, was not simply a doctrine he wrote about, but a state he had actually lived through. Later in his life, Rumi found another profound companionship, this time with a goldsmith-turned-disciple named Salah al-Din Zarqub, and after Salah al-Din's death, with a scribe and devoted student named Husam al-Din Shalabi, and it was under Husam al-Din's encouragement and careful transcription that Rumi composed his other monumental work, the Masnavi, a sprawling didactic poem of some 25,000 couplets, often described as the Quran in the Persian tongue, because of how deeply its stories and teachings are woven from Quranic themes, prophetic narratives, folk tales, and mystical philosophy, all directed toward guiding the seeker along the very path of Marifat that Rumi himself had walked with Shams. It is worth noting this continuity, because it shows us that Shams did not simply give Rumi one burst of poetic inspiration that then faded. Shams initiated something permanent in Rumi, a fundamental reorientation of how Rumi related to knowledge, to love, to the divine, and to the purpose of a human life, and that reorientation continued shaping Rumi's output for the remaining decades of his life, right up until his death in Konya in December of the year 1273, an event still commemorated today, particularly in Turkey, as his Shab-e Arus, his wedding night, the night his soul was finally reunited completely with the divine beloved he had spent his whole later life longing for. So what, finally, is the hidden path of Marifat that this story illuminates for us, sitting here so many centuries later? I think it teaches us several things, and I want to walk through them carefully, because I believe they are as relevant to each of us in this room tonight as they were to a scholar and a wandering dervish in 13th century Anatolia. The first lesson is that knowledge and knowing are not the same thing, and that a person can accumulate an enormous amount of the first without ever having touched the second. Rumi was by any measure one of the most learned men of his age before he ever met Shams. He could debate law, interpret scripture, discourse on theology with total command, and yet something essential was missing, something that all his books could not give him. This should give pause to anyone, in any field, who mistakes information for understanding, who mistakes the ability to discuss a subject for the experience of having lived it. Marifat asks something different of us than accumulation asks. It asks for presence. It asks for a willingness to be undone by what we encounter, rather than simply cataloging it. The second lesson is about the role other human beings play in our spiritual and inner lives. Rumi did not attain his transformation alone, through solitary meditation or private study. He attained it in relationship, in the messy, demanding, socially costly reality of deep companionship with another human soul. This matters enormously, because so much of contemporary spiritual culture emphasizes individual practice. individual enlightenment, the solitary journey inward. The story of Shams and Rumi reminds us that sometimes the divine reaches us most powerfully through another person, through a friendship or a love so intense that it strips away our defenses, forces us to confront the parts of ourselves we have carefully hidden even from our own awareness, and shows us as if in a mirror the truth we could not have found by looking only inward in isolation. The third lesson, and perhaps the most difficult one, is about the price of transformation. This story is not simply a pleasant tale about friendship and enlightenment. It is also a story about jealousy, about a community that could not tolerate the intensity of what it was witnessing, about a beloved companion who very likely paid for that intensity with his life. Real transformation, the story reminds us, is rarely comfortable for everyone around the person being transformed. Rumi's own household, his own students, people who presumably loved him, could not bear to watch him change in ways they did not understand and could not control. There is a warning here, and also a kind of compassion we might extend both to those who transform and to those who struggle to accept that transformation in someone they love. The fourth lesson is about what we do with loss. Shams disappeared, and by every ordinary measure, that should have been the end of the story, a tragedy with no redemptive value, a friendship cruelly and mysteriously cut short. But Rumi did something with that grief that changed the shape of world literature forever. He did not simply mourn. He transmuted his mourning into some of the most exquisite poetry ever written in any language. Poetry still read, still recited, still sung, still danced to, in dozens of languages across the globe 800 years later. This does not mean grief should be treated lightly, or that loss is somehow a blessing in disguise that we should rush past. It means that even our most devastating losses can, with time and with the right inner orientation, become the very material out of which something enduring and beautiful is built. Rumi's grief did not disappear. It transformed into the Diwan-e Shams-e Tabrizi, and eventually the Masnavi, into an entire life's work dedicated to helping others find the very path he himself had been shown. And the final lesson, the one I want to leave you with tonight, is the lesson embedded in Rumi's own realization after Shams's disappearance, that the beloved was never truly separate from him to begin with. In Sufi metaphysics, this points towards something profound about the nature of divine love itself. That when we truly love, and truly know, the boundary between self and other, between seeker and sought, between lover and beloved, begins to dissolve. Shams was, in this understanding, not simply a teacher who gave Rumi something Rumi did not have. Shams was a mirror in which Rumi finally saw the reflection of the divine reality that had been within him all along, waiting only for someone with the courage and the fierce honesty to help him see it. This is, perhaps, the deepest meaning of Marifat. It is not knowledge acquired from outside ourselves. It is a remembering of what was always already present within the depths of our own being, uncovered through the grace of an encounter powerful enough to strip away everything false standing in the way. I began tonight by asking what it means to truly know, rather than merely to know about. I want to close by suggesting that each of us, in our own way, is walking some version of Rumi's path. Most of us will never meet a Shams of Tabriz exactly as Rumi did. But all of us at some point in our lives are given encounters, relationships, losses, and moments of being profoundly undone that have the potential to crack open the same doorway that cracked open in Rumi 8 centuries ago. The question this remarkable story leaves us with is not whether such moments will come to us, because in one form or another they will. The question is whether we will have the courage, when they arrive, to let go of our carefully built certainties, the way Rumi let go of his, to sit in the fire of an encounter we cannot fully control or explain, and to trust that on the other side of that fire waits not destruction, but the deepest and most authentic knowing a human heart is capable of. That, friends, is the hidden path of Marifat. And that is how a wandering dervish named Shams reached into the soul of a brilliant, respected, and utterly unfulfilled scholar named Rumi, and lit a flame that has not gone out in 800 years, and that, if we let it, burns still tonight, here in this room, in every heart willing to be broken open by love. Let me take you a little deeper into the texture of this story now, because I do not want tonight to be only a sequence of events, dates, and conclusions. I want you to feel the atmosphere of 13th century Konya, to understand the stakes that made this encounter so shocking to everyone who witnessed it, and to sit for a while longer with the actual character of the man named Shams, because he deserves to be more to us than simply a plot device in Rumi's biography. He was a complete human being, with his own decades of struggle, his own fierce inner life, long before he ever set foot in Konya. Konya at that time functioned as the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, a Seljuk Turkish state that despite constant pressure from the advancing Mongol armies to the east, had cultivated a genuinely remarkable center of learning and culture. The sultans of Rum were patrons of architecture, of poetry, of Sufi orders, and the city itself was a magnet for scholars fleeing the destruction the Mongols were bringing to Central Asia and Persia. This is an important detail, because it means the intellectual environment Rumi inhabited was not provincial or isolated. It was cosmopolitan, competitive, and status-conscious. Madrasas in Konya trained jurists who would go on to hold real positions of civic and religious authority. To be a respected professor of religious law in this city was to occupy a position of genuine social prestige, comparable in some ways to holding a senior academic chair at a great university today, complete with the deference, the income, the network of loyal students, and the reputational capital that such a position confers. Rumi had all of this. He was, by the time Shams arrived, arguably the most prominent religious teacher in the city, having succeeded not only his own father, but also a subsequent teacher, Burhan al-Din Muhakkik Tirmidhi, who had continued Rumi's spiritual and scholarly formation after his father's death, and who had, in his own way, already begun preparing Rumi's heart for something beyond dry legalism, planting seeds of mystical sensitivity that Shams would later bring into full and violent bloom. Into this world of settled prestige walked a man who owned almost nothing. Traditional accounts describe Shams arriving in Konya, dressed in rough black felt, the plain garment of a wandering ascetic, carrying no credentials, affiliated with no recognized order, known to almost no one in the city. He is said to have taken up residence, initially, not in any place of honor, but in a humble inn used by traveling merchants, a detail that later Sufi writers loved to dwell on, because it underscores just how invisible Shams appeared to the world at the very moment he was about to alter the course of Islamic spiritual history. This contrast, between outward poverty and inward magnitude, between social invisibility and spiritual immensity, sits at the very heart of the Sufi worldview, which insists again and again that the outward form of a person, their clothing, their title, their wealth, their credentials, tells you almost nothing reliable about the state of their heart. Shams himself is recorded, in the collection of his sayings known as the Maqalat, as expressing sharp impatience with people who judged spiritual rank by outward appearance, who assumed that a man in fine robes, reciting eloquent sermons, must necessarily be closer to God than a ragged traveler sleeping in a caravanserai. This was not simply an abstract philosophical position for Shams. It was, we might say, the entire operating principle of his life, and it explains why he was so uninterested in building the kind of institutional following that would have made him famous and comfortable. He seems to have regarded fame itself as a kind of veil, another form of ego that could just as easily separate a person from God as wealth or worldly ambition could. What did Shams actually teach, in substance, once the companionship with Rumi began? Reading through the fragments of the Maqalat that have survived, translated and studied by scholars in more recent generations, several themes recur with striking consistency. Shams speaks again and again about the danger of second-hand religion, of a faith built entirely on imitation, on repeating what one's teachers and books have said without ever personally verifying any of it through direct experience. He is remarkably blunt about this, at times almost harsh, dismissing even great and celebrated religious figures if he sensed in their words only borrowed conviction rather than lived certainty. He speaks about love, ISHQ, not as a metaphor for religious devotion, but as the actual mechanism by which a human being comes to know God, insisting that intellectual argument alone can never accomplish what love accomplishes, because love does something that argument cannot. It dissolves the very boundary between the knower and the known. He speaks about companionship, suhat, as sacred in itself, arguing that sitting in the presence of a person who has genuinely realized spiritual truth transmits something to the sitter that no book, however wise, can transmit, because presence carries a kind of living transmission that text on a page simply cannot replicate. This is in fact precisely what he offered Rumi, not new doctrines Rumi had never encountered in his studies, but the direct, unmediated experience of sitting beside someone who had actually walked the path those doctrines described. It is worth pausing here to reflect on why this kind of transmission is so difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it, and so easy to dismiss from the outside as mere charisma or emotional intensity. We live today in a culture that is, in many ways, even more oriented towards second-hand knowledge than 13th century Konya was. A culture saturated with information, with articles and videos and lectures available at the touch of a screen, where it is entirely possible to become extremely well informed about spiritual traditions, philosophical systems, psychological insights, without any of that information ever actually reorganizing how we live, how we love, how we suffer, how we die. Rumi's transformation stands as a kind of permanent rebuke to this pattern, a reminder that there is a categorical difference between knowing that love can dissolve the ego and having one's own ego actually dissolved by love. Shams did not add information to Rumi's mind. He detonated something in Rumi's heart, and this is precisely why the encounter was so disruptive to everyone around them. Because detonations by their nature cannot be scheduled, controlled, or made socially convenient. I mentioned earlier that Rumi's students grew resentful, and I want to sit with that resentment a little longer, because I think it is one of the most psychologically honest and instructive parts of this entire story. Consider what it must have felt like to be one of Rumi's devoted disciples in the autumn of 1244. You have spent years, perhaps your entire adult life, studying under this brilliant and generous teacher. You have organized your identity, your daily rhythms, your sense of belonging, around your relationship to him and to the community he leads. And then, seemingly overnight, a stranger arrives, a man with no credentials you recognize, no lineage you can verify, and your teacher disappears behind closed doors with this stranger for days and weeks at a time, emerging changed, sometimes barely recognizable, speaking differently, behaving differently, no longer delivering the lectures you had organized your life around attending. It would be strange if this did not provoke jealousy, confusion, even genuine fear that something dangerous or even heretical was taking place. Historical accounts describe Rumi's students accusing Shams of sorcery, of having bewitched their master, language that reveals just how threatening and inexplicable this transformation appeared to people watching it from outside. There is real compassion to be extended here, in both directions, to Rumi for having found something so vital he was willing to risk everything familiar for it, and to his students, who lost, in a very real sense, the teacher and the community structure they had built their lives around, without ever being given the interior experience that made the loss comprehensible or bearable to Rumi himself. This tension, between the individual's need for direct, disruptive spiritual encounter and the community's need for stability, predictability and continuity, recurs throughout the history of every mystical tradition, not only the Sufi one. It is present in the story of countless saints and mystics across religious traditions, who were in their own lifetimes regarded with suspicion, even persecuted, by the very communities that would later revere them as saints once enough time had passed to soften the disruption their lives had caused. Rumi and Shams are, in this sense, part of a much larger pattern in human spiritual history, a pattern in which the depth of transformation a person undergoes is almost always, in the moment, indistinguishable to onlookers from madness, scandal, or betrayal, and only becomes legible as sanctity, as wisdom, as Marifat, with the passage of enough time and the maturing of enough perspective. Let us return now to what happened after Shams vanished for the final time, because I want to draw out a few more details about how Rumi's grief actually took literary shape, because the specifics matter and because they are genuinely moving. The Masnavi, which Rumi composed in his later years under the encouragement of Husam al-Din Shalabi, opens with one of the most famous passages in all of Persian literature, a passage describing the cry of a reed flute, cut from its reed bed and fashioned into an instrument, moaning with longing to be reunited with the source from which it was severed. Rumi uses this image of the reed as a symbol for the human soul itself, cut off from its divine origin and crying out through the whole of a human life to find its way back to where it came from. It is difficult, knowing what we now know about Rumi's own life, not to hear in that opening image an echo of his own severance from Shams, his own soul crying out across the years for reunion with a companionship that had shown him, however briefly, what wholeness actually felt like. Rumi did not simply write about the pain of separation abstractly. He had lived it, twice, first when Shams disappeared to Damascus, and Rumi sent his own son to retrieve him, and then finally and permanently, when Shams vanished without any possibility of retrieval at all. The scale of the Masnavi itself deserves a moment of appreciation, because it is genuinely staggering. Some 25,000 couplets, composed over roughly the final 12 to 15 years of Rumi's life, weaving together folk tales, animal fables, stories drawn from the lives of the prophets, anecdotes about kings and beggars, mystics and fools, all in service of illustrating principles of the spiritual path, all circling back, again and again, to the same central insight that had been given to Rumi through his relationship with Shams, that the divine beloved is not distant, not external, not something to be reached only through rigid observance of external law, but something to be discovered through love, through the purification of the heart, through the courageous willingness to have one's certainties broken open. Generations of Persian-speaking Muslims have grown up with lines of the Masnavi memorized the way other cultures memorize proverbs or scripture verses, and the work has been studied, commented upon, and taught continuously in an unbroken tradition for 800 years across Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Ottoman lands, remaining to this day one of the most influential works of religious literature ever produced within the Islamic world. We should also speak briefly of what became of the relationship's legacy in institutional form, because Rumi's transformation did not end with his own death in 1273. His son Sultan Walad, who had himself traveled to Damascus years earlier to bring Shams back to his grieving father, went on to formally establish the Mevlevi Sufi order, organizing the ecstatic practices, including the whirling turn that had first emerged, we are told, out of Rumi's own spontaneous states of spiritual absorption, into the structured ceremony known as the Sama, performed to this day by trained practitioners known in the West as the Whirling dervishes. This ceremony is worth understanding correctly, because it is often reduced in popular imagination to simply an exotic performance. Within the tradition, every element of the Sama carries symbolic weight: the dervish's tall camel hair hat representing a tombstone, the black cloak worn at the beginning representing the grave, the white skirt beneath it representing the burial shroud, and the moment when the cloak is removed and the dervish begins to turn representing the soul's release from the confines of the body and the ego, spinning in remembrance of God with the right hand turned upward to receive divine grace and the left hand turned downward to pass that grace onward to the earth and to all creation. It is quite literally a physical enactment of the very principle Shams awakened in Rumi, the dissolving of the separate self into a larger reality of love and remembrance, made visible, made danceable, made into something a community could participate in together, rather than something reserved only for the rare, isolated mystic. The Mevlevi order that grew out of this legacy went on to become one of the most influential and long-lasting Sufi orders in Ottoman history, with lodges established across the empire, patronized at times even by sultans, producing generations of poets, musicians, and calligraphers who considered themselves spiritual descendants of Rumi. And Rumi's poetry itself, both the Diwan-e Shams-e Tabrizi and the Masnavi, spread far beyond the boundaries of any single order or institution, translated over the centuries into Ottoman Turkish, into Urdu, into Arabic commentaries, and eventually, especially from the 19th century onward, into the major European languages, until, by our own era, Rumi has become, remarkably, one of the most widely read poets in the entire world, his verses quoted in wedding ceremonies and hospital rooms, in therapy offices, and university literature courses, across cultures and religious backgrounds that have little else in common with 13th century Anatolia. It is a strange and moving thing to consider that a private, almost unbearably intense friendship between two men in a mid-sized Anatolian city 800 years ago has rippled outward to touch, in some form, the inner life of people on every continent on earth today, most of whom have never studied Islamic law, never heard of the Seljuk Sultanate, and know Shams, if they know him at all, only as a name mentioned briefly in the introduction to a poetry collection. I want to return now, before I close, to the practical question this story poses to each of us, because I do not think it is enough simply to admire Rumi and Shams as figures from a distant and romanticized past. The real challenge this story leaves us with is much more uncomfortable than admiration, because it asks us to examine our own relationship to certainty, to status, to the comfortable identities we have built for ourselves. Rumi, remember, was not a failure looking for meaning when Shams found him. He was a success. He had achieved exactly what his society told him a respectable religious life should look like. And it was precisely that achievement, that comfortable mastery, that had to be disrupted before real knowing could begin. This should give each of us pause, whatever our own particular field of accomplishment or expertise might be, because it suggests that the very things we are proudest of, the credentials we have earned, the reputations we have built, the certainties we have arrived at through years of careful study, can just as easily become the walls that keep us from Marifat, as they can become the foundation that supports it. The question is not whether we should abandon knowledge or achievement. Rumi did not abandon his scholarship. He transformed it, and later channeled his mastery of language, of theology, of narrative, of law, into some of the greatest religious poetry ever composed. The question is whether we remain willing, even after we have achieved competence and respect in our chosen domain, to be surprised, to be undone, to sit in front of someone or something that does not fit our existing categories, and to admit honestly that we do not yet know everything we assumed we knew. I think too about Shams's own decades of wandering before he found Rumi, because there is a lesson in that patience as well. Shams did not stumble upon Rumi by accident in his youth. He searched by traditional accounts for years, decades even, moving from city to city, teacher to teacher, always sensing that the full weight of what he carried had not yet found a vessel strong enough to hold it. There is something instructive in this too, a reminder that readiness matters as much as opportunity, that the right encounter arriving too early, before either party is prepared, might simply pass unrecognized, might do damage rather than good. Rumi, by the time Shams arrived, had spent decades preparing, through study, through his father's early spiritual formation, through his years under Burhan al-Din Muhakkik Tirmidhi, without ever quite realizing that all of this preparation was itself a kind of readiness for an encounter he could not yet imagine. Sometimes the years we spend doing careful, patient, even seemingly mundane work are themselves the preparation of the vessel, even when we cannot yet see what that vessel is being ready to receive. And so, friends, as I bring this evening's reflection to a close, I want to leave you with an image rather than a conclusion, because Rumi himself always preferred image and story to abstract argument, and it seems only fitting to honor that preference here at the end. Picture, if you will, that autumn day in Konya, the dust of the marketplace, the respected professor on his mount surrounded by his attentive students, and a rough stranger in black felt stepping forward out of the crowd, reaching for the reins, asking a single unbearable question. Picture the silence that must have followed, the students confused, perhaps offended on their teacher's behalf, and then picture Rumi's face as he answered, as something in him recognized, before his conscious mind had fully caught up, that his entire life was about to change. That single moment, that willingness to actually engage the stranger's question rather than dismiss it, that openness in a man who had every social justification to simply ride past, is, I think, the real hinge on which this entire story turns. Everything that followed, the seclusion, the poetry, the jealousy, the disappearance, the grief, the Masnavi, the whirling dervishes, the 8 centuries of readers finding themselves in Rumi's verses, all of it flows from that single moment of a settled, accomplished man choosing to stay present to a question that threatened everything he thought he knew. That is the hidden path of Marifat, and it is hidden not because it is secret, but because it is so easily walked past, disguised as an inconvenient stranger, an unsettling question, a friendship that does not fit our plans, a loss we did not choose and cannot explain. May each of us, when our own version of that autumn afternoon arrives, find in ourselves the same courage Rumi found, the courage to stop, to listen, to let go of the reins we have held so tightly, and to let love do what only love, and not all the learning in the world can ever truly do. Thank you.